Ready? Okay. Well, good morning. I'm Sharon Stolzenberger, and I welcome you to my studio here at Front Street. Front Street is a combination of buildings that's just east of the downtown area. And I would like to thank Connie and Rosie for inviting me to do a demo. I thought we were going to be live and get to see everybody, but with these COVID days, it's probably best that we do this virtual. So I appreciate Connie's expertise in this, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to do a watercolor demo today of an animal. That's what I started out doing years and years ago. I worked at Gibson Greeting Card Company and then quit the job to go out into the street to do the outdoor art fairs, which I've been doing for a number of years. So when I first started, I worked wet in watercolor. This was a freelance calendar that I did for Gibson back in 1984. So it's pretty sophomore, but I thought I was really hot stuff back then. And ever since Gibson and doing the soft animals, I've worked from watercolor to mixed media. This is a card I did back in 1973. Again, watercolor. I was working very loose and not a lot of detail. I appreciate the Asian and Oriental brush painting, and I like the simplicity of it. So I continued working with the medium. This is a crane chick. Don't know if this reads or not very well. Did this back in the 70s and up to the 2000s, where I did this cat. So my technique went from sort of a nice expression looseness to a little more tightness over the years. And then I've been playing around with mixed media, also doing some things with watercolor on gesso, which is old news, but the leaves have been monoprinted from painting the real leaves, printing them down, letting the paper dry, and then pulling the leaves off. And the bird is gouache. So technically this is mixed media, but it's watercolor on gesso, and the bird is done with gouache. So I've been doing a lot of this type of thing lately. Some of the things that have inspired me along the way, I've taken workshops with Nita Ingalls. I've taken workshops with Marilyn Phyllis, Homer Hacker, all of the old-timer names, all of the really top watercolorists. And along the way, too, I've had my work published in some of Nita Leland's books, Confident Color being one of them, and Exploring Color, and her first book on exploring color. Also have some drawings in this book here, drawing and painting from nature. I've collected a number of wildlife artists' books and technique books too, because there's always something that you don't know how to do. And I love this one by Tunnicliffe. He was a British artist, and just wonderful, wonderful field sketches, very loose. This is an excellent way, as you know, to learn about your subject. Go out and draw from life and observe. Dave Rankin, who's a Cleveland artist, has a wonderful book on fast sketching. He's great. And of course, this is one of the Northlight books on drawing fur and feathers. This is a very detailed type of book, so if you like doing a lot of super photorealism, this would be a nice one. And a lot of these books I have for form, shape, and technique. They're just nice to relate to. More recently, I have enjoyed the works of Anne Blockley. She's a British artist, and some of you may be very familiar with her. I love her techniques, especially with the granulation medium. And so she has inspired the piece that I showed you with the chickadee on it, plus things like this. This is just a start. It's acrylic and watercolor granulation medium, just starts that I'm going to play around with. Also, this artist caught my eye. I didn't know her, Hazel Sloan, another British artist. Love her wet and wet stuff. I love that simplicity. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work. So I think we probably all have pretty comprehensive libraries according to what we enjoy doing. Today I'm doing a watercolor animal. I have painted Scottish Highland cows. They obviously are from Scotland. They have really long, almost dread-like fur, which is excellent for watercolor because you learn how to paint the positives and the negatives. So I had done some demos of the adult Scottish Highland cows, so I didn't want to repeat myself in case somebody had seen a demo. Connie, I think, is going to photograph a few things closer up later in the video, but these are, this is the same painting. It's the female cow, and you can see how delicious it is to do these animals in watercolor. Today I am going to do the calf of one of these Scottish cows. Allwood Audubon Center used to have Scottish Highland cows, but they sent them back to the breeder. So they don't have them now, but there was a breeder in Bellbrook who had them out where you could see them along the road, so I got lots of photographs of them. So if you like really juicy, washy subject matters, I think the cow, the Scottish Highland cow, would be a good one to paint. So when I'm working larger on watercolor paper, I like to staple it down. I wet it, both sides, put it down, and then staple it. I haven't mastered the art of just simply taping the paper. It doesn't work for me. So I usually do this the day before I'm going to paint on the surface, and it's dried pretty flat. I had it sitting outside yesterday to dry, and some insect got smashed on here, so that's going to be a little extra texture. I've used the gator board here, but quite often I use plywood. It takes time, but I'm used to doing this, and it's the way I like to work. So to get started, I've already put out my paints. I use a combination of Winsor Newton paint and some Holbeins and Daniel Smith paints as well. Just whatever works, whatever color seems to work the best. So I try to work, for the most part, wet into wet. Excuse me. I should add, too, that as you know, painting a subject is learning how to express it in 3D, especially true for animals where you really need to see them in person so that you can see the sculptural shape. You see the form, you see everything about the animal and become familiar with it. That's why it's a good idea, as you know, to go out and sketch from life. I take most of my own photographs because I can get the kind of poses I want, and I'm out there looking at the animal. I get subjects from the backyard. I'm a volunteer educator at the Cincinnati Zoo, so I've had numerous up-close and personal opportunities with animals, and plus I've had some trips. Several years ago, had a trip to Africa, Nepal and India, and Peru. Peru is what got me started painting llamas, and that was back in the, let's see, Peru was, late 80s. So I wet the paper, and then if there's a lot of puddling, I like to use a sponge just to pick up the excess moisture. I like these two brushes here, an advertisement for Judy Betts. This has really got nice spring, and then I think this might be a Richardson, I don't remember. In fact, I think I'll start with a larger one. And I think what I'll do is just throw some paint, brush some paint. Got a breeze coming into the studio here from the open door. For some reason I've gotten accustomed to using a flat brush to do animals. It may not be the best brush because you get the hard edges of a square brush, but I'm accustomed to it. Now, even though I'm not a photorealist painter, I do think it's important to understand the anatomy of the animal and the shapes. So I'm being particularly careful. I want to get the sense of the forehead of the animal, but I don't want to paint everything at once. I don't want this to be flat. I want it to start to have some form to it. And the other way, of course, is to move your brush. The hair has curls in it and grows a certain way. Push your brush that way. I know you can't really see this in the photo, but the ears are a shape. There's a flat plane on part of the face. There's where the muzzle splooches out a little bit. So all of those things act as guides to tell you how to shape the animal. When I first started painting animals, I tried to do the whole animal in one fell swoop. And I have to say that I think in many cases that worked out better. I was working fast and direct. And some of that I feel has gone a little bit out of my work. When I'm working wet into wet, I don't care to use a hair dryer. Not crazy about the noise it makes. Plus, as you know, if the paint's really wet, it's just going to be pushed around by a hair dryer. And already this paper is drying. It's a little bit humid today. I thought maybe the paper would stay wet a little bit longer. What I really love about this technique is the way the paint feathers out and makes the soft edges. So I'm working with a lot of water on the brush. I think I'm doing that because this is a rather large surface. I want to be sure that I don't start getting really hard edges. Not sure what I'll do with the background yet, but I want the back of the animal to be light. The technique that I've used for my animals is one that I started experimenting with on my own years ago when I was at Gibson. I did a couple of designs for them. I just started out painting a couple of animals and didn't really want to do the every fur and feather technique, so I started working loose with the watercolor. I don't know why this paper is warping right down the center here. That doesn't usually happen. I've usually been able to stretch the paper without too many problems. And you know the way it is with watercolor, sometimes it does what you want it to do, and sometimes it does what it wants to do. And I think the key is, as cliche as it sounds, you go with the flow, which is particularly true with watercolor. If something else is happening and it's working, you go with it. I'm going back in here to accentuate some of these hairs on the forehead and establishing that there's the forehead plus then where the muzzle comes out. So I want to leave that area where the muzzle is fairly light. I'm kind of being cautious here. In my reference, there are shadows under here, and I'd like to be able to keep this in shadow as I paint and not try to get too detailed with it. When I look at a book like Hazel Sloane's, I'm inspired because it shows me that you don't have to add everything. You can be selective. This little shadow here is going to define the side of that, the muzzle, or the, okay, all right. The paper is, of course, still wet, but when I get to a certain point with putting the washes down, I like to come back in again with the square brush and use this edge. And just like if you were painting a landscape and were pulling out weeds and other parts of a landscape, you come in and start pulling out some hair shapes. Now this really needs to be darker so that what I'm doing here shows up more. But as the paper is wet, it's nice to come along. Don't try to paint the hairs. Pull the hairs out. I'm probably using a color that's a bit staining, so I'm not getting exactly what I want there. And because the paint is not real dark, you're not seeing a contrast in these lines I'm pulling out. But with animals like this, especially, you can over-exaggerate, which is nice because that's part of the character of this animal. So where I'm pulling out these little hairs, is going to leave me spaces where I will then go in and negative paint in between the hairs. I want to leave this bone above the eye socket light for the moment. And if the paint hasn't bled as much as you want, you can wet the brush and sort of dry brush it to pull out hairs. So it makes this fun doing this kind of an animal. You can just really kind of go crazy with all this texture. He looks like a sheep now. This is still pretty damp, but I'm hesitant to go back in here because I could start having what I call the blossoms and the skins forming where moisture from the brush does not match the moisture on the paper. So sometimes I'll let the piece totally dry and then completely wet it again. If you let a piece like this stay for a day or so, you can go back in and carefully wet it again without lifting too much paint. Part's drying. I don't like these hard edges. If you go in with a slightly lighter value, you can modify it as you need to. There's the shadow here of his other leg. And I'm trying to allow for the wisps of hair that come over that. There are some really nice folds of his hair in here, and it's just nice to take the edge of the brush and indicate that. I need to just have this a little wetter, I think. I'm using a lot of burnt sienna and a little raw sienna here, and some sepia. Gonna get a back run there if I'm not careful. We're in the city. I wanted this to be a little darker. That's the reason I'm going back over this. And if you hear some loud thuds, just know that my studio is above a bodybuilding studio of all things, a bodybuilding gym. And when they drop those weights, it jars the building. Many of you have probably been here to Front Street for First Fridays and been up to the Artery where Rosie's a member. I think she's still a member. Some of the people from what used to be the Old Town and Country Gallery. There are a lot more artists here than there used to be, so it's becoming a rather active art community. As I'm adding paint and pulling paint up, I'm thinking about how I'm going to work the hair. And I would like to show you a little bit more about how I pull the hair out. The paper is still a little bit wet, but like to do that. I'm going to add a little bit more paint to the ear here. So painting the ear, then I'm conscious of the skeletal shape of the cow's head. So I'm trying to define that by painting the ear behind the bones around the eye socket. Okay. I had pulled out some of the hairs on that ear. So I'm going to go back in and indicate the inside part of the ear, but I'm trying to paint in between the hairs that I've already pulled out. So it gives you kind of a broken look, and it's for me, a little more naturalistic. And then I come over here, and so I begin to define those hairs by painting the inside of the ear that's behind the ear. Sometimes in a painting like this, it's easy to start getting in and doing all the little details and the fun things too soon. And so that's a caution when you're working wet into wet and using a lot of negative space painting. I mean, that's part of the fun part of this, is the noodling with negative space. Now, I will do a little quick demo of painting the eye. I don't paint the eyes first. There are wildlife artists who do paint the eye first. And for me, it's part of the expression that comes at the end. And I'm starting out with burnt sienna because I want some of that to show through when I add the dark. So I'm just doing the shape of the eye. More modeling will come as I finish this. Calves are so cute. Do the inside of the nostril light at first, and then as the paint dries, then you go back in and add the dark areas. And I like the little bleeding that's occurring there. Sometimes when you work this way, you really don't know exactly what you have until you step away from the piece, as you know, and come back to it in a day or so, and then you can see your shapes, what you've got to work with, what you need to accentuate, what you need to paint over. I really like this part of it, and you can get carried away with it by pulling out the hairs. Okay. I think what I'll be doing is finishing this up after the demo is over, and then either photograph it myself and email it to Connie, or she'll take a picture of it when it's finished and then upload it to the organization. Sometimes you have to be careful going in with your darks too soon if the paper is wet, because, as I said before, the differences in wetness from your brush to the wetness of the paper can cause problems. Even though he's got kind of a woolly looking coat, I see some little scriggles in here, and this is another nice way to add some texture. looks like a worried little guy. Okay. Probably this is as much as I can do while the paper is moist. It's much easier to go in and do some of the shadow work, pull out some stuff after this dries a little bit. There's always little things that you see that you want to play with. The little deep portion of that nostril. Don't want to make it a solid color across because you see flesh around part of that nostril. And just a little darkness where the light's not getting in there. Okay. Thank you.